What's going on, rockers? Welcome to podcast episode number 4 of the Tenacity Podcast, where we talk about all things rock and roll. I'm your host, Gavin, with my partner in crime, Josh. Josh, how's it going today, sir?
It's going really great, and I'm looking out my window right now, and just like last week and the week before that, it is a beautiful day to talk about all things rock.
Absolutely, and what an episode we are going to be talking about today, guys. Everybody has their favorite singer. Everybody has their favorite time. Now, the bands we are going to be talking about today, so we're actually got 3 bands that are on our list to talk about today, and they all have one, if not 2, because we're going to talk about a little bonus topic from all 3 of these guys towards the end of the podcast episode. But these 3 bands have one thing in common. They have 2 different lead singers. They have had not one, but 2 different lead singers in their span that have been iconic. Now, obviously, a lot of bands, when they get started, they have maybe a singer for a little bit. I know the last band we're going to talk about, they had a couple before they had their first hit lead singer, but then they moved on and they had another hit lead singer. So today we are talking about these bands and who did it best. Now, I want to hear you guys in the chat talk about which one you think, because I know we may have our own opinions on why we think these guys did it best, but I want to hear from you guys. Who do you think did it best? So the first band on the list is an older band. They have been the talk of many a generation. Anyone who's in, especially the metal genre, these guys are considered, in a lot of historians, now there's always debate on that, but the fathers of metal with their song War Pigs. We are talking about the band Black Sabbath.
Yes.
And of course, Black Sabbath is such an incredible band. When they first were introduced so many years ago. And of course, they have actually had 2 lead singers who have been super iconic. And let's talk about who that first lead singer was. Josh, I know you know who this first lead singer is. He's always on our minds. The Prince of Darkness himself, who is
Mr. Ozzy Osbourne.
Mr. Ozzy Osbourne.
Labeled as the king of metal. Hats off to him. Regardless on what anybody thinks, hats off to Ozzy Osbourne, because he's responsible for so much of what we enjoy today. Just iconic, and a very entertaining guy too. I enjoy. It would be cool to sit down with Ozzy. He'd be a cool guy to just sit down and talk to. Gotta love Ozzy. Ozzy Osbourne. Prince of Darkness.
And then the second lead singer that they had during their iconic era was the man, the myth, the legend. In fact, it's also debatable, but the man, I believe, who was also introduced the rock and roll sign. So if you've ever seen the hook 'em horns or the rock symbol that a lot of people do at concert, he was actually originally introduced by this man, Ronnie James Dio. Yep. He is a man who has been incredible. Could have had 2 different possible career paths with singing, which the original could have been opera singing, and he chose to go into rock and roll, and we are so glad that he did. But let's talk about these 2 guys, and let's do a little bit of a comparison on who did it better. So the first band we got to talk about Ozzy, because he is the first lead singer of the band. In fact, he is, at all intents and purposes, the guy who founded the band when it first came out, because he was the man who had the PA system, and he put up a description looking for a band and said, you guys have to have a gig, but I have my own PA system for the gig. And so what a perfect way to get things started is with this guy. And Josh, I know you know some of their hit songs. When it came to Ozzy Osbourne, just list a few. What are the band songs that were a hit with Ozzy?
Well, Paranoid's one of my favorites. And then also, everybody knows War Pigs. Just pause real quick about War Pigs. Just one of my favorite songs to jam out to, not only on the drums, but just listen to, and the way Ozzy sings it. I love the way Ozzy comes in singing it. Iron Man. I love Iron Man. It's a good song. Um, I almost said Mr. Crowley, but I think Mr. Crowley is just Ozzy, isn't it?
I believe
Uh,
so, because Ozzy has his own career doing
yeah.
that one.
But anyway, just to name a few. But Black Sabbath's greatest hits are definitely one of the most played albums on my Spotify playlist. Actually,
Absolutely. And then coming into Mr. Ronnie James Dio. And of course,
mm-hmm.
Dio had a lot to kind of come into when uh, Ozzy was initially. Now, I know Ozzy will say he left the band, but for all intents and purposes, we know the history behind it. He was unfortunately booted from the band, and
Yeah.
for a lot of his own by his own fault. However, he has an amazing comeback story
Oh yeah.
towards the end of this podcast, which I want to share that towards the end because it also leads into Mr. Dio, his departure from the band as well. But Dio, as what it did seem is like I believe he only had about 2 albums that he did do with Black Sabbath
Mm-hmm.
after Ozzy left. Which the one that I know of that I have heard from him is, and this one's not. I don't see it doesn't seem as popular as the other ones, but Country Girl that he did with them. He has such an amazing song, and of course the song Die Young that he did with them. Uh, he had a lot. He had a few hits, but when it comes down to what did better, who did it best, I believe, Josh, I think we might be at a same consensus on who was the better vocalist on this and who actually was the more impactful one. I would
Mm-hmm.
have to say, for me, my vote is on Mr. Ozzy himself.
Absolutely. Me too. Absolutely. And that's just, I mean, 'cause when you think of Black Sabbath,
Uh,
you think of him, and you also think of the fact that if it wasn't for him, there'd be no Black Sabbath.
and it kills me because I do like Mr. Dio. However,
Oh,
I would
absolutely.
have to say I love Dio when Dio did his solo career. Dio had an amazing solo career with some amazing songs, and in his own,
Holy Diver.
Holy Diver, Rainbow in the Dark. If you have not listened to any of
Yes.
Dio's solo career, this
Yes.
man was, and he was so good at playing this, giving you this idea that he was like this image of evil, and he's
Yeah.
not, but he has such a way of making you think that of him. Like he knew how to play on uh like just making it the creep factor, but he was an amazing frontman. But when it comes to Black Sabbath on who did it best, who do you know with Black Sabbath? It has to be Ozzy Osbourne.
Has to be Ozzy Osbourne. And you know, I was listening to a Black Sabbath song that from the Dio years that I really enjoy called "Children of the Sea." Not sure some of the listeners have heard that, but it's actually one of my favorite songs by it during the Dio years. That's just something I forgot to mention. But absolutely agree with you, my brother. I mean, you can't talk about Black Sabbath without talking about Ozzy. And like I say, Dio years had some good songs, but the Ozzy years had great songs, iconic songs, timeless
Yeah,
songs. And Ozzy Osbourne is just in a league of his own. He's just, I mean, he's the Prince of Darkness for a reason.
absolutely.
Yeah, I got to go with Ozzy, just like you. Yeah, Ozzy
Yeah.
Osbourne.
And guys, let us know in the chat if you were on Ronnie James Dio's side or on Ozzy Osbourne's side. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you have your favorite song from either singer, let us know because we'd love to hear it. And by the way, it does not have to be their Black Sabbath days. Both went on to do their own solo careers and both did amazing jobs on their solo careers. Love both of them. We just think for this vote, Black Sabbath, the most iconic member, has always been Ozzy Osbourne. But now we are going into our band number 2. Now, this band has been riddled with so much drama, so much conflict, but they have 2 amazing history where they were able to lose their iconic singer and bring in another amazing singer that went on to get them so many awards just in their first album. And we're talking about the band Van Halen. And Van Halen has 2 amazing singers. And the first man would be Mr. David Lee Roth. And I believe in one documentary I watched him, he was David Diva Lee Roth. because he had such a high personality that
Yeah.
he had. And then we also have the singer, amazing, had his own solo career, was doing albums all on his own before he even got into Van Halen. And we're talking about Sammy Hagar, a man who is
Yeah.
still touring today, even though he is, I believe he is in his 60s. But let's talk about these two incredible singers right now. Josh, help me out here with some of the David Lee Roth hit singles. Like, he had some amazing stuff with Van Halen, and I know you know some of his. We can tell which one was theirs.
Yes. Well, and also like with David Lee Roth, just to point out too, another topic for another thing, but he is also on my list. I got here on my list of one of the most unique figures in rock music. Not taking away from Sammy, I'm just saying. I'm David Lee Roth was, but I would have to say, when you think about the songs, so I would have to say, I mean, everybody knows "Jump,"
Absolutely.
and everybody "Hot for Teacher." I mean, oh man, "Hot for Teacher." I really like and enjoy "Dance the Night Away." That's another one I really like. So just to name a few, but you gotta take into account too that Van Halen, and this is something that we kind of touched on, not on the podcast, but just us talking. Van Halen, a lot of people go to see Van Halen. They want to see Eddie Van Halen. And people that first get into the band, first get into Van Halen, they think that Eddie Van Halen's the leader of everything. I mean, because you're just thinking it because of the name, right? And they almost overlook David Lee Roth or Sammy Hagar because of just Eddie Van Halen, which understandable because, again, another topic, and I'm trying not to talk in circles here, but Eddie Van Halen, one of the greatest guitar players ever, and that's something we'll touch on some other time. But I would have to say definitely just Van. We were just talking about the other day how Van Halen, how Eddie Van Halen is in a league of his own, but David Lee Roth, I could also make the argument David Lee Roth, he is in a league of his own as far as the frontman of Van Halen. And I kind of jumped ahead, I guess, and told people what my choice is. Not taking anything away from Sammy, but I would have to go with David Lee Roth for me. I'm sorry. I know that was a more long-winded answer than I usually get. But.
I love it because you're on the David Lee Roth side, and I have to give him credit too because he's a very energetic man. I watched YouTube. I watched some of their live performances, and it is hard because Eddie Van Halen is an amazing, and of course with his passing, rest his soul, because he's an amazing guitarist. He inspired so many people with the way that he played, and a lot of people try to copy and mimic what he could do because of how incredible he was at playing guitar. And it takes a personality, it takes a special person like a David Lee Roth to even come close to being able to keep up with a man like Eddie Van Halen, because you've got an amazing guitarist, you need an amazing vocalist. Now, I will give him the personality. He had the personality. But when it comes to vocals, if you're listening to the music side, for me, it has to go with Sammy Hagar. And let me tell you why. That man was already doing hit songs before his time with Van Halen. And then, of course, he comes into Van Halen, and he's got some incredible hits. With Eddie Van Halen, he was originally, when David Lee Roth was leaving the band, they were trying to go from hard rock to introducing synth. And that's one of the cool things why you can tell the difference between the two bands is that David Lee Roth was during their hard rock era. Of course, because they have the songs like Eruption, Ain't Talking About Love. They have all these other like hard rock songs. But when you get into their Sammy Hagar era, you get a whole nother sound that they were able to introduce, and with a whole different sound, like the song Right Now. If you haven't heard that one, that is an amazing song. I believe they've won more awards for that song than any other songs they've written. And then, of course, the song Why Can't This Be Love? It is an amazing song, and it's usually one that you can associate with them because this is when Eddie started playing a lot more piano intros and actually allowed Sammy Hagar to play guitar on some of their stuff. But
I just realized I just missed the perfect opportunity. I don't know if some people, a lot of people are familiar with the classic movie Joe Dirt, but they were asking Joe Dirt about his favorite bands, and I guess I should have, the way Joe Dirt answered, I should have answered of this choice. He said, Van Halen, not Van Hagar. It's just funny.
Now, guys, that's both of our opinions on these. We'd love to hear, are you a David Lee Roth Van Halen, or are you the Sammy Hagar Van Halen fan? And give us your reasons why, and what song is it from which era that you think is your favorite? Because we are obviously at two different ends of the spectrum, David Lee Roth or Sammy Hagar. But let us know, guys. We'd love to hear what your guys' favorite.
Funny, we're finding this out too. We're finding this out, but it's good. It's good to have dialogue like this. It's good, and there's no right or wrong answers. It's all opinionated, and I mean, it's.
Yeah, you got to learn. You have to learn, and guys, you have to learn like that. Not everybody's going to be as interested in the stuff that may not agree with you on every era. I mean, we're both for Ozzy Osbourne, but there's probably somebody out there that's for Ronnie James Dio. And then, of course, when it comes to Van Halen, we're on two separate sides of the spectrum. But now, guys, we're going to get into the final one. This is probably the most conflicting one. And this one is actually really hard for me because I had to really dig deep on what my answer is for this band. And now this one's going to be rough because there's a lot of controversy with who's the better vocalist for this band because they both take it in such a different way. Now, this band has had other vocalists before this, but none as impactful as these two. And we're talking about the band AC/DC. So, who did it better? The man, the myth, the legend, the man who has is a living legend. Well, passed away legend, but he is still an incredible man. Bon Scott, or Brian Johnson. So Josh, I'm going to hand this off to you on who did it better or did it best. Brian Johnson or Bon Scott?
No pressure. So, So this is something that I've wrestled with actually because I'm in love with both eras. Obviously, as a diehard AC/DC fan, so I had to really sit down and think. Okay, so what is my actual opinion? So and usually I have no problem just saying, okay, well, I like both, but I pick such and such. But I had to really brainstorm. This was a brainstorm thing for me because. Obviously, when you think of Brian Johnson, for example, Back in Black, one of the best-selling albums of all time. Obviously, great album, Brian Johnson. But one of my all-time favorite albums was Bon Scott, was High Voltage, and so I had to really just think I love both eras. So here's what I will say, and here's the conclusion I came up with, and this is my opinion. And usually I will just give you a simple answer, like either Bon Scott or Brian Johnson. But so. For me, and I love both eras, but for me, I think that actually Bon Scott wrote the best songs, just in my opinion. But I think Brian Johnson has a better stage presence and has the best stage presence. And so again, this is kind of like, I feel like this question for me is kind of like, what kid do you like say I have like a few kids and like what kid do you want to pick? Well, I love all my kids, all right, but uh, this is definitely one of those things. But it's good to talk about because it really challenges your brain. So I think I'm gonna have to go. Okay. I think Brian Johnson. Let me just say this for the record, and then I'll pass the torch to you. Let me just say this. I think Brian Johnson has one of the best stage presence I've ever seen. Great vocalist, great albums. Obviously, Back in Black. For those about to rock, I mean, I love all of them. But I'm gonna. I might be the underdog saying this, but I think I'm just gonna have to go with my gut, and I'm just gonna have to say Bon Scott, honestly. And here's why. I'll say why. I think Brian Johnson has the best stage presence, like I alluded to, and you can't go wrong with any of his stuff. But Bon Scott, there's just something about Bon Scott and his like. It's a long way to the top if you want to rock and roll and you know Dirty Deeds. That just I'm gonna have to go with that, even though I love both eras a lot. Love them. But I'm gonna have to go. I think I'm gonna have to go, and this is a hard choice for me because I love both of them. Both of them are like my idols. But I'm gonna have to go with Bon Scott. Barely, just by. I know they can't see me, but I'll do like just by this much. And this was a hard. This was something I really had to do a lot of thinking on because it was hard. And you can't go wrong either way. Both eras are iconic, and both guys are amazing. And I love Brian Johnson so much. But yeah, just by the littlest thing you can think of, just I guess because you got to make a decision, right? At the end of the day, I'm gonna have to go with Bon Scott, but I love them both.
Absolutely. I totally get that. So when I was looking at this decision on what do I think would be the better of the two, I think with Bon Scott had a way with a lot of the songs he wrote for the working man. He wrote for the working class, and that's just the way that he wrote. And that was one of the things, like, he was relatable. And so people loved him for that. And not only that, he has such a full voice when he sang.
Yeah.
And not only that, being able to play, I mean, I believe he was actually originally from Scotland, I believe, or his dad was, because he could play the bagpipe, and that's one of the reasons why they won't play that song, "It's a Long Way to the Top," anymore, because Bon always played it. He always he had the solo, and so it just didn't feel right to do that song without him. And so very few people can do a song that good and no one else will play it after you. So I have to give him credit for that.
Yeah.
Now leading into the man himself, Brian Johnson. Brian Johnson had a really, probably the biggest struggle when he came into the band, because he was coming into a band that was already popular and already had a well-established lead singer, like, leading the charge, because this band had a amazing reputation. They were popular. Bon Scott unfortunately passing away, and so he had to come in. And most people, if you've ever seen somebody come in and try to pick up where somebody left off, it doesn't always go the best, and it is always really a struggle, because there's an expectation to be able to do what that person did, and that's not always the case. However, very few people can say that on their first album that they did with their band, being the new guy in the group, selling more albums than any album they ever put out with Bon Scott. And so for me, my vote has to be, and yes, Josh had it right when he said the stage presence. I totally agree with that. I think when it came to energy, Bon Scott had some incredible energy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Now, and one of the things that's so hard with this one is that the two do not sound alike in any way, shape, or form. They both have their own vocals. They both have their own way of approaching a song. And so it really just comes down to, who did you enjoy listening to more? And so for me, thinking about all the songs I listened to from AC/DC, And I would have to say I listen more to the songs that Brian Johnson wrote.
Yeah.
Shook Me All Night Long is a song that I enjoy. And of course, you can't go wrong with their song Back in Black or Thunderstruck.
Right.
Amazing songs. Or even the one song Hell's Bells. This is like,
Yeah.
these are all songs they've done that are just so iconic. And even Brian Johnson has done and does a really good job on some of the stuff that Bon Scott did. When he does a really good job on the song Highway to Hell. He is like, these are just incredible songs, and he's done hit after hit after hit.
I've often thought, like, you can bring Bon Scott. I know you can't, but if we could bring Bon Scott from the dead, I'd love to hear Bon Scott sing Back in Black. That would be interesting.
But here's another interesting thing. AC/DC already had Brian Johnson selected as this is the guy they're going to bring into vocally, because Bon Scott, even before he passed, had said there was no one else he thought was a great singer except for Brian Johnson. He said there was no one else. So even Bon Scott was like, hats off to this guy. He's a great singer. Yeah. And so to me, Brian Johnson is the guy. And I know this is going to be like, we and him, or Josh already have the disagreements on, he's for Bon, I'm for for Johnson. And guys, we want to hear from you guys in the chat. Who do you think did it better? Is it Bon Scott or Brian Johnson?
We both love, like we both love too. Like Gavin loves the Bon Scott era, and I love the Brian Johnson era. But it's just, you know, and this was something, and not only for me. I imagine, Gavin, this was a challenging thing for you too, because obviously this was a good. This is a topic, because we're both big AC/DC fans, and this is a topic that's always talked about, but it's also one of those things to where, especially if you love both eras, you really got to sit down and think like, okay, well, who do I prefer? And so I know this wasn't necessarily like, this wasn't the same thing in saying like, you know, like, hey, what'd you have for lunch today? It's not something simple like that. It's something that you really got to think. And now for others, it may be easier.
Absolutely.
For me, I can say challenging thing, but yeah, I got to go with Bon. But I love Brian Johnson too. But yeah, absolutely. You just got to go with your gut.
Yeah, and guys, okay, so we've labeled who we think was our favorites and who we believe did it best on these bands. We want to hear from you guys. I mean, Black Sabbath, was it Ozzy or was it Dio? Van Halen, was it David Lee Roth or Sammy Hagar? For AC/DC, Bon Scott or Brian Johnson, guys, we want to hear it. And what is your favorite song that singer did for the band? And now, we talked about these bands actually have two things in common. So, of course, all three had iconic vocal eras. But did you know they all had a third person that sang for them beforehand?
I did know that, and that's weird you just said that, because I was actually just thinking about that. I didn't know if we were going to have enough time to touch on that, but yeah, that's a lot of people don't know this, actually.
Right. So kind of getting into, of course, Black Sabbath. So, and this is a story I really was hoping we had time to tell. But so when Black Sabbath originally was getting ready to, you know, they were kind of going off the scene. They were still touring with Dio. Ozzy, in his own right, was building his own solo career, which was skyrocketing far greater than what Black Sabbath career was going. And so, and I don't remember how this all played out, but Black Sabbath, eventually, Ozzy was deciding to do a show. And I believe it was a 2 or 3 night show. And Black Sabbath was invited to open for Ozzy Osbourne. How hilarious is that, to be kicked out of your own band and then turn around and say, okay, I now am bigger than you guys in popularity. I want you to come and open for me. Well,
you know, that is funny. You talk about irony, but that is you got to wonder how Black Sabbath were feeling about that. Like,
Well,
man,
apparently they didn't care as much as Mr. Dio did, because Dio's words were, "I have more respect than that." And Dio quit before the shows even started. And so,
well, and this is a similar subject to I just want to really briefly bring this example up. We touched on a band called Falling in Reverse last time, and the lead singer Ronnie Radke used to be in a band called Escape the Fate. He got kicked out, ended up doing some jail time. They kicked him out of the band, but years later, Escape the Fate on a few occasions, I believe, has opened up for Falling in Reverse. So I just thought of that because it's a similar thing. Like, it's crazy. You get kicked out of the band, and then the new band you start is bigger than the band you got kicked out of.
indeed,
I just thought that.
But going into their this third vocalist that they've had, and it is the man, and this man is so multi-talented, incredible vocalist. For the last, I believe it was 2 or 3 shows they had, Dio would quit the band and would not play for the opening act. However, they did find a vocalist who would be the third and final vocalist for Black Sabbath, and we're talking about Rob Halford of Judas Priest.
Yeah.
This man, amazing vocals, major range. I believe we've talked about him briefly in a couple other episodes, but he would be the final member of the band and would lead the vocals for those few shows. And it was it's just an amazing person. I don't think they've never had a person who is not an iconic singer in their band. Every single singer they have has had a unique voice in their own right and has done their own accomplishments through their career. And all three have also had their own solo career. Rob Halford would eventually leave Judas Priest for a brief time and start his own solo career. And so Ozzy, Dio, and Rob, all three had their own solo career. So just an incredible fact about this rock and roll band. But now moving into Van Halen. Van Halen would have a third vocalist. Now, he would not be in there for very long. I don't believe he actually even had a record that they released with him on it. But he was their vocalist for an extremely brief time. And this man would be Gary Cherone, and he was the hard rock frontman for the band called Extreme. And of course, he would only be in there for a brief time. And it was kind of back when Van Halen had already gone through Sammy Hagar, and they were slowly just on a decline where they weren't putting out a lot of albums. And I think that's one thing with Van Halen. Van Halen's such an incredible band. And the only thing and this is what every band struggles with, is when you get to a certain level, there is a certain thing called ego that can surface.
Yeah.
And they had every right to have an ego because of what they've achieved, especially Mr. Eddie Van Halen, because of all the things he's accomplished. In fact, writing a great deal of their songs on his own with Sammy Hagar and David Lee Roth. But over time, of course, that band would not progress. But that is their third member. Now we got to talk about AC/DC also had a third, granted briefly, final member that would be their vocalist with Brian Johnson. During his time, he would go deaf. And it was a whole show where one of his ear monitors for his sound would fall out. Yeah. And he would hear the full force of 100 Marshall amps into his ear, which would cause him to go deaf. Now, over time, he's actually been able to get new hearing monitors that have actually helped with his hearing to where he can be back on tour with them. Thank goodness for that, because it wouldn't be the same without him. But they had one member who was able to step up and be their vocalist for a short time, who I don't know very many band members or very many vocalists who can say they have been the frontman for two of probably the most iconic bands in the world. And that would be the man Axl Rose, the frontman of Guns N' Roses. And it was back when he was actually getting Guns N' Roses back together, because they'd been apart for so long. And not only did he get to frontman for Guns N' Roses on their tour, but he got to frontman for AC/DC, and it was such an incredible thing because I don't know if you've ever noticed, but while he's no Brian Johnson at all by any means, shape, or form. But if you had to pick somebody who could come close to AC/DC's expectation of a frontman, especially Brian Johnson's vocals, you cannot go wrong with a man like Axl Rose.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Axl Rose, you think about his voice and you think about, I mean, I could totally see him covering any AC/DC song because of the great voice he had for it. He absolutely had, I mean, yeah, if you had to, you eliminate, of course, Bon Scott's not here. Brian Johnson went deaf for a while. So who would you think of? Yeah. Absolutely. Axl Rose was the perfect pick.
Absolutely. And these are just a few bands of incredible, and Guns N' Roses is a band that I want to talk about in more detail on this podcast, but that will be for another episode, because guys, that is it for today's podcast. We want to hear from you guys. Let us know what you thought. Let us know your opinions on who's the vocalist you enjoyed more, and what is the songs you enjoyed of today, and who should we talk about next on the podcast. And if you enjoyed the song on today's podcast, let us know. Link for that will be in the description, and you can also find it on wherever social media you are listening to this podcast on. We hope you guys have had a great time, and until next time, keep on rocking in a free world, y'all.
Yes, and regardless of y'all's different opinions, one thing we can all agree on is we need to keep rocking.
Absolutely. And for those about to rock, Josh, we salute you.
We salute you.
Take care, everybody.